Let me start with something that sounds wrong. Logical reasoning isn't actually about logic. If it were, then philosophy majors would dominate this section automatically, math prodigies would crush it, and everybody else would be stuck forever. But that's not what happens. What actually happens is this: smart, disciplined students walk out of logical reasoning saying, I understood every argument, so why did I miss half the questions? And that sentence right there tells you everything. Because understanding is not the same thing as executing the task. And the LSAT does not reward understanding, it rewards process. Logical reasoning is not asking, does this make sense to you? It's asking, can you ID what this question is asking you to do and do it the same way every single time? And that is a very different skill. And that is why logical reasoning is so frustrating, because you read the argument and you think to yourself, yeah, that seems reasonable. You read the answers and you think to yourself, honestly, a few of these sound okay. And now you're stuck. At that moment, intelligence actually works against you because instead of executing a method, you start debating. You argue with the test, you rationalize answer choices, you talk yourself into things. And that's exactly what LSAC wants you to do. Logical reasoning punishes improvisation, and it rewards repeatable decision making. Now, here is the skill logical reasoning is actually testing. Can you recognize patterns faster than you react? High scorers don't figure out logical reasoning questions, they recognize them. They can identify them in the moment. They see the structure, they see the task, and they know what the correct answer must do. And once that happens, the question slows down. Not because they're rushing, but because they're not guessing any longer what game they're playing. So let's be very clear about this. The real reason students miss logical reasoning questions is not a lack of intelligence, a lack of effort, or a lack of studying. It's that they don't ID the question type fast enough. They start trying to solve it before they even know what problem they're solving. And once you do that, you're already behind, because every single logical reasoning question has a job. And if you don't know the job, every answer choice looks tempting. Now, here's what happens when you don't recognize the question type. You read the stimulus carefully, you nod along, you feel confident, and then you read the question stem. And instead of saying to yourself, oh, I know, this is a weekend question, you say to yourself, okay, let's see, what was that again? So you're reacting. And you're reading the answers hoping that one will feel right, and that makes you vulnerable. And this is why logical reasoning feels random to so many people. One question feels easy and the next feels impossible. And then you miss one that you were sure about. And that is the result of an inconsistent process. The LSAT's not changing, but you are changing. Specifically, your approach is changing from question to question. And that's deadly on a standardized test like the LSAT. Now, here's another trap. Students will think that certain logical reasoning questions are just hard. But most of the time, those questions are only hard because you didn't know the task to be done, or you didn't recognize the structure, or you were using the wrong mental tool. And once you use the correct tool, the difficulty will drop immediately. Now, I'm not promising it's going to drop down to zero, but it'll be a lot more manageable. Now, high scorers do something very simple and very boring. They ask the same questions on every single logical reasoning problem. They're asking, is there an argument here? If so, what kind of argument? What does the right answer need to do? So they're not getting creative or clever, they are consistent. And consistency beats brilliance every single time. Now, going with your gut fails because your gut is not trained for the LSAT. Your gut is trained for real life, and real life is messy. The LSAT is an artificial environment. And on the LSAT, they include attractive wrong answers on purpose. They are designed specifically to feel reasonable. And if you're relying solely on instinct, you will consistently choose the second best answer. And the second best is always wrong. It's tempting, but it's wrong. In logical reasoning, they're not asking you to invent logic on the fly for the first time, not to reinvent the wheel. They're asking you to sort the argument from the fact set, assumptions from evidence, and sort correct tasks from tempting distractions. And once you know how to sort, speed will come naturally as a consequence. And I've been doing this for 20 years. There is a very specific moment when logical reasoning changes for students. It's when they stop asking, "What do I think about this?" and they start asking, "What is this question asking me to do?" And that shift alone is worth major points because it removes noise. Now, most students respond to their frustration in logical reasoning by adding more question types, more tricks, more shortcuts, and that usually makes things worse because the LSAT rewards clarity, it's quality over quantity. So you don't need more tools, you got to know when to use the few tools that matter. Now, the LSAT is not creative. It doesn't care about you being an original thinker. In fact, it repeats, by design, the same few structures over and over again. That means logical reasoning is mechanical, and mechanical is good. You want things to be predictable. Your goal is not to be confident. Your goal is predictability. If you could say, "Oh, this is one of those questions again," you've already won half the battle because now the choices are no longer equal. So, my goal today is not teaching you how to think harder, it's teaching you how to think the same way every time, regardless of the question. That's how you make logical reasoning reliable. And you can improve on logical reasoning more easily than you can on reading comprehension because it is structured. If you know the patterns, your improvement will compound over time. Accuracy first, then speed. So, if logical reasoning is feeling hard for you, it doesn't mean you're bad at logic. It means your process is inconsistent, and inconsistency is fixable. And so I want you to know that every logical reasoning question has a job. And once you ID the job, the right answer becomes predictable. So in your studying, I want you to not think of yourself as having to become more talented or smarter, but to become more disciplined to improve your pattern recognition abilities. And so, what we're going to talk about now is how logical reasoning actually works. Every single logical reasoning question is testing a particular mental task. And once you understand that, logical reasoning is going to stop feeling like some pile of unrelated questions, a grab bag of 26 different questions in the section, and it'll start feeling like a small set of jobs that repeat over and over and over. Students think logical reasoning is about politics or science or economics or ethics, but it's not. Those topics are surface level camouflage. The LSAT could swap or change around the subject matter of every single question, and nothing about the difficulty would change because the underlying task always stays the same, and that is incredibly good news because it doesn't mean that it means that you don't need to learn more. You've got to recognize things faster. They are not creating thousands of different unique logical reasoning questions. In fact, they create a small number of questions and recycle them relentlessly. They just change the wording or the length or the level of abstraction. But underlying that, the task, the structure, and the traps will all remain the same. And once you see that, logical reasoning stops feeling random. Now, LSAC, the people who make the LSAT, the Law School Admission Council, they use three main tools to disguise repetition. The first tool is length. They will add extra sections that don't actually change the argument. The second thing they will do is abstraction. They will replace simple ideas with more formal language. And the third thing they will do is include familiar sounding wrong answers. Answers that might feel reasonable, but they don't do the job. And none of this makes the question harder, it just makes recognition slower. Now, most students try to get faster by rushing, and that unfortunately never works. High scorers get faster because they recognize the task early. If you can recognize the task, you will read the argument differently. You will predict the job that the correct answer has to do, and you will be able to eliminate aggressively, and speed will follow as a consequence. However, if you don't know the task, here's what happens. You read the stimulus carefully. You read the answers carefully. And everything sounds plausible. Everything sounds reasonable. And as a result, you're just guessing because you're missing the framework, and the LSAT will punish you for that. Now, there is a moment in logical reasoning where a question suddenly feels easier because you are able to classify the type. It's when you say to yourself, "Oh, this is strengthen," or "this is must be true," or "this is flaw." And once that happens, things become a lot less mysterious. Now, every logical reasoning question falls into one of three buckets. Those are argument analysis, assumptions, and inference and evaluation. If you know which bucket you're dealing with, you'll know how to solve the question. The first bucket, argument analysis, is about structure. These questions will ask, for example, what's the conclusion? What role does this sentence play? How does the argument proceed? And what is wrong with the reasoning? These questions are asking you to understand how the argument is built. Doesn't matter whether it's true or whether there's a gap. It's all about the structure. Now, students will struggle with this type because it feels abstract. You're dealing with method of reasoning or role of statement or flaw. But these questions are actually very mechanical because they're asking you to label parts of an argument. And so for that reason, they're predictable. The second bucket or family is assumptions, and that's where most points are. These questions are assuming there's an argument, so there's no fact sets, and something important is missing in the argument. Your job is to ID that missing link. So we're talking necessary assumption or sufficient assumption or strengthen or weaken. Might have different labels, different question types, but they're dealing with the same core logic. Now, the reason that assumption questions feel tricky is because the right answer is often not stated. You might want to see the answer in the stimulus or the argument, but it's not there, and that's the point. If you can accept that, the questions are going to become a lot easier. But the third bucket is different. Inference and evaluation, those often don't have arguments at all. Those are more often going to be fact sets. They're asking what has to be true, what is most supported, what information would help you evaluate the argument. And in this case, assumptions are actually dangerous because you've got to stay inside the facts. Now, the biggest students make across buckets, across question types, is they use the wrong tool for the bucket. They're looking for assumptions when there's no argument. They're looking for flaws when it's a fact set. Or they over-strengthen the argument when all you've got to do is make an inference. So if you can fix that mismatch, if you can correctly ID which bucket you're dealing with, your accuracy is going to increase as a result. But buckets can simplify things because they reduce your decision making. If you know which bucket you're dealing with, you no longer have to ask, what do I do here? You just ask, which bucket am I in? Then your next steps are going to be a lot clearer. Now, high scorers don't read logical reasoning questions to understand them. They read them to classify them. Understanding will come later and often isn't even actually necessary. If you can classify, you can execute. Now, the problem with a lot of prep resources out there is that they overwhelm students with dozens of different question types. They overcategorize things. And with 500-page textbooks, unfortunately, that creates confusion. The LSAT is not rewarding your ability to memorize labels. It's rewarding your ability to understand the task to be done. If you can know those 3 different buckets, that's going to be enough. And that's why I'm so big on predictability, because that makes every question familiar. I'm not promising things will always be easy, but they will be a lot more familiar. That means you've seen it before, you know what they want you to do, and that's the feeling that you're ultimately aiming for here. Now, when students first improve in logical reasoning, they notice one thing. They start to feel calmer because nothing surprises them anymore. That is, if you're not surprised anymore and things are a lot more consistent, it's going to be a lot easier for you to solve them. And so the next step is to zoom in on the specifics here with analyzing the arguments, seeing the structure. Because if you can't see what the argument is, what the author is trying to prove, or how the pieces fit together, everything becomes much harder than it needs to be. And most mistakes don't come from hard logic, they come from misidentifying the structure of the argument. Every logical reasoning question, the first thing you want to do is see whether there is an argument here, meaning, are they trying to convince you of something? If the answer is yes, then there's a conclusion, there's evidence, and the structure of the argument matters. If the answer is no, and there's no argument at all, you got to stop looking for assumptions because there aren't going to be any. An argument has 2 parts, a conclusion, what the author believes, and evidence, which is why the author believes it. That is it. An argument is not a list of facts, a description, or background information. And you will clear up a lot of your logical reasoning confusion once you stop trying to force arguments where none exist. Students miss conclusions in arguments for one main reason. They confuse importance with belief. Evidence will often sound more concrete. It'll be more detailed. It'll be more persuasive. But the conclusion is the author's opinion. It is the claim the author wants you to accept. So you always want to ask, If the author could only keep one sentence in this argument, which one would it be? That sentence or that clause is the conclusion, which brings us to conclusion questions or main point or complete the argument. Those question types are all doing the same thing. They're asking, what is the author's ultimate claim? They might have different wording, but the task to be done is the same. So your job is not to paraphrase the entire passage or fact set, or argument. It's to identify the end goal of the argument. Now, the big trap students fall into here is they pick something that supports the argument instead of what the argument is trying to prove. Now, one skill that's going to help you a lot with this is understanding indicator words, specifically evidence versus conclusion. Evidence indicators will be things like because or since, due to or after all. Those are the most common evidence indicators. Then your conclusion indicators will be things like therefore, thus, hence, so, or clearly. Now, there are no 100% guarantees when it comes to indicator words, but those are strong signals that you can use to orient yourself, but you still got to think critically. One way they level up the complexity or difficulty of an argument is by including subsidiary or sub-conclusions. That means the argument might have more than one conclusion. So a sub-conclusion is a statement that is supported by the evidence, but it then in turn goes on to support a bigger conclusion. And unfortunately, students will often mistake the sub-conclusion for being the main point of the argument. So the fix here is simple. You want to ask which conclusion everything ultimately serves. What are they ultimately driving towards? Now we've also got role of statement questions, which often scare people because they feel a bit more abstract. But the task here is actually pretty simple. They're asking you, what job is this sentence doing in the argument? Is it evidence? Is it conclusion? Is it counter premise? Or is it background? You cannot answer this without understanding the entire argument first. So the way to solve role of statement questions is first you ID the main conclusion, you ID the evidence, you locate the statement in question and you ask how does it fit into the structure. And then, and only then, do you look at the choices. So in other words, you're predicting or you're prephrasing what you think the role is. Relatedly, we have method of reasoning questions. They're asking, how does the author go about making their argument? Not what they conclude or whether it's true, it's how they reason. They might be using a study or a survey. They might be arguing by analogy or eliminating alternatives or appealing to a general principle. But you've got to ignore the content. The topic doesn't matter. You could replace their subject matter with nonsense and still be able to answer the question. You want to focus on the logical steps that they're taking. Now, relatedly, we have flaw questions, which are everywhere on the LSAT. They are one of the most common types of logical reasoning questions. And the key idea is that every flaw is a gap between evidence and conclusion. Sometimes the gap is a classic fallacy. Sometimes it's a missing consideration or a bad comparison, but there is always a gap. Now, the biggest mistake students make on flaw questions is going straight to the answers. But what you want to do instead is first articulate or prephrase, have your own wording for the flaw first, and then look for a choice that describes it. If you can describe the flaw simply in your own words, the right answer becomes a lot clearer. And there are some flaws that are classic or famous, like correlation causation, confusing necessary and sufficient conditions, sampling errors or sampling bias, and others are more context specific, where they fail to consider a relevant factor or they assume similarity where none is proven. And it could be any of the above, anything I mentioned. Anything is fair game, so you just got to hunt for the gap and first prephrase in your own words, then look for LSAC's articulation of that. Now, one of the most hated question types is parallels. You have parallel reasoning and relatedly parallel flaw. And parallel questions are exhausting because there's a lot more words. They're multiplying your workload by giving you 6 different arguments, the one in the stimulus, then the 5 choices. And so abstraction here matters more than anywhere else on the LSAT. And so what you want to do is you want to abstract the argument first. You strip it down to its skeleton. You want to ignore the topic or the examples or any emotional language. You want to focus on the logical form of the argument and the relationship between the premises, meaning the evidence, and the conclusion. And once you can do that, the right answer is usually going to stand out. But they're wordy, and there's only a few of them. They're not the most common type. And so if you see one that appears late in this section and it looks complex, you might want to flag it and skip it and come back to it later because they're time intensive. Every question on the LSATs work the same. So you might want to come back later when you've already secured the easier points. That's just a strategy you might want to adopt. But everything I've been talking about here falls into the same bucket. It's all one skill. It's about seeing the structure of the argument. If you can do that, things are going to become a lot easier and a lot cleaner. And your ability to analyze arguments will improve in every other area as well. You don't want to skip to assumptions until you've mastered argument analysis, because if you don't know what the conclusion is or what supports it or how they built the argument, assumption questions will feel harder than they should. And so analyzing or analysis is the gateway or introductory skill on the LSAT. Once you master that, then we get into assumptions. Now, assumptions are the highest value area in logical reasoning. So if I could train you on only one part of logical reasoning, it would be this, because these are the most reliable points. We're talking here necessary assumptions, sufficient assumptions, strengthen, and weaken. In these types, there's always going to be an argument. Something is missing, there's a gap, and your job is to find what is missing and plug that gap in some way. Because arguments rely on unstated or unspoken links between the evidence and the conclusion, and the LSAT is testing whether you can see those links. And students struggle with these questions for one main reason. They'll read the argument and they think to themselves, that kind of makes sense, but the thing is that kind of is not good enough. The LSAT ultimately doesn't care whether an argument feels reasonable. It cares whether the logic actually works, and assumption questions expose that gap. The most common type in this category is necessary assumption questions. A necessary assumption is something that must be true for the argument to work at all. If it's false, if you negate it, the argument falls apart. So these questions will have words and phrases in the question stem like depends upon, requires, assumes, or presupposes. But these questions are not asking you to prove the conclusion or strengthen the argument or add new evidence. They're just holding the argument together. You want to think of them like a hidden beam in a building. You don't see it, it's hidden, but if it's gone, everything falls apart. Now, the way you test a necessary assumption is by negating the answer choice. If negating it would destroy the argument, then it was necessary. If the argument still survives, then it wasn't necessary. Now, when in doubt, all else being equal, they're usually more moderate, because extreme language is easy to negate without destroying the argument. That's why extreme answers are usually wrong here. So if you're down to two choices, not totally sure, negate both. And when you're not sure, even after negating, all else being equal, more moderate is more likely to be correct. Now, a lot of students will conflate necessary assumption versus must be true. And there's an important distinction here. Must be true questions might not involve arguments. They could be pure fact sets. In contrast, necessary assumption questions always involve arguments and always involve unstated logic. Now, in contrast, you have sufficient assumption questions. These are very different, even though students often confuse them. A sufficient assumption is something that, if true, would guarantee the conclusion, not simply help it or support it, but guarantee it. So for these, they're going to have very different words and phrases in the question stem. They'll have words and phrases like allows, enables, properly inferred if assumed, or follows logically if assumed. And so these are all equivalent to sufficiency. They're telling you that if you added this in, the argument would then become airtight. Now, for sufficient assumptions, extreme language is okay. Totally fine, doesn't matter how strong it is, or doesn't have to be true in real life, but if it were true, it would do the job of guaranteeing the conclusion 100% based on the evidence. So to clean it up, necessary assumptions, more moderate, all else being equal, need to be the case. They collapse the argument when negated. In contrast, sufficient assumptions don't need to be true, and they could be extreme, and they would prove the conclusion if you accepted them as fact. Remember, the keyword or the phrase in the question stem tells you which one you're dealing with. Now, strengthen questions are helping the argument, but they don't need to prove the argument. They just ask you to make the conclusion more likely. So you want to look for words in this question stem like supports or justifies or simply strengthens. Now, strengthening questions will often do one of four things. They might eliminate alternate explanations, they might simply support the evidence, they might increase the relevance between the evidence and the conclusion, or add helpful new information. It is, of course, okay to bring in new information for a strengthening question. That's why they're adding the phrase "if true" to the question stem. Now, the difference between strengthened and sufficient assumption is that strengthening questions are asking for what helps or increases the probability of the conclusion logically following. Sufficient assumption has to guarantee that the conclusion will logically follow. Now, weakened questions are the mirror image of strengthened. They ask you to make the conclusion less likely. So you want to look for words in the question stem like undermines or casts doubt or calls into question. And for a weakener, doesn't mean you have to destroy the argument, just has to hurt the argument. If the conclusion becomes less likely given the evidence, that's good enough. Now, weakened answers do the opposite of strengthened answers. So they might introduce or promote an alternate explanation. They might provide counterexamples. They might attack a study or survey the arguments based upon, or they might add new evidence that goes against the conclusion. And of course, it's okay for them to bring in new information because of the if true in the question stem. Now, a lot of students will confuse weaken versus flaw questions, but a key distinction here is that weaken questions open the door to new information. Flaw questions just ask you to ID a problem with the argument as it already exists. Now, for anything in this bucket, anything in this assumption family, prediction is a totally valid approach because you want to ask yourself, what is missing here? What would make the argument more or less likely based on the gap in the argument? If you can predict the gap, the right answer will often become obvious. The wrong answers will seem a lot less tempting. So these are a lot more pattern-based and, frankly, just more frequent than other types. And so they're well worth mastering. The three most common types of questions on the LSAT are necessary assumption, inference, and flaw. So that's where I would start. Necessary assumption falls in, of course, the assumption bucket. So you want to ask yourself, which one does the job at hand here? Which one performs the task they're asking us to do? Now, the third bucket is inference and evaluation. And this is going to feel different because the logic is a lot more strict. They're asking you what logically follows from what is written in the passage, meaning the stimulus. Many questions in this bucket are fact sets, meaning there is no argument at all. There is no conclusion. There's no evidence, just a bunch of information. So they might list facts, describe a situation, or explain relationships between different statements. They're not trying to convince you of anything. They're just telling you how things are. Must be true, which includes inference questions, where inference is the umbrella term for must be true and most supported. That's where you want to start, one of the most common types here. They're asking for what is 100% guaranteed by the stimulus. So they'll use words and phrases like must be true, properly inferred, logically follows, but there's no if in the question stem after that, just what follows from the information above. They mean exactly what they say. They're not looking for you to draw real world conclusions or add in common sense. You got to stay in the text they've given you. So the first thing you want to do is connect the facts in the passage. If there are conditionals, you might want to diagram them. If there are overlapping categories, you want to look for that overlap. And if nothing jumps out immediately, totally fine. You work by elimination. The wrong answers are going to be too strong, too broad, too specific, or just frankly unsupported. The right answer is the only one that must be true based on the information in the passage. And like necessary assumption questions, when in doubt, go for the more moderate language because more moderate statements are more likely to have been required by the passage or stimulus than more extreme language would be. So you want to gravitate towards words like some or often or at least one. Much easier to guarantee than words like all or never or only. More extreme answers would require more extreme proof, and most fact sets just don't give that to you. Now, most strongly supported questions are another variation on inference, but they're a little bit looser. They've got a broader standard. So those are not requiring total certainty, just very strong support. You want to think of this as being like 90% likely or higher. So they'll say most strongly supported or best supported. What is a reasonable inference or reasonable assumption? Incredibly likely to be the case based on the information in the fact set, what has the strongest backing. So you want to approach these by comparison. You want to ask yourself which answer uses the most information from the stimulus or goes the furthest without overreaching. So again, must be true, zero wiggle room, strict logic, totally 100% guaranteed. In contrast, most supported, very likely, strong backing from the passage, but there is some flexibility. Now, a less common type that you only want to work on after you've mastered the others is evaluate the argument. These do involve arguments, but they're not asking you to either strengthen or weaken. They're just asking what information would help us judge whether the argument works. These are neutral. So the right answer could strengthen or weaken depending on which way you answered it. So you ID these by looking for question stems like what would be most useful to know or what would help evaluate the argument. These are diagnostic type questions. So you want to think of this like swing factors. If the answer goes one way, it makes the argument stronger. If it goes the other way, the argument looks weaker. And if the information doesn't affect the argument either way, it's wrong. So it's all about relevance to the conclusion at hand, relevance to the question that is being evaluated here. But across all of these types, there is one rule that dominates. You do not go beyond the text. You don't add in any assumptions. You don't fill in any gaps. You're not bringing in any outside real world logic here. Now, the reason students lose easy points on these types is because they're rushing or overinterpreting or making unwarranted assumptions, and the LSAT will punish you for that right away. You want to stay inside the information given. So the skill this bucket is really testing is restraint. Can you resist adding in assumptions of your own? Can you resist filling in gaps beyond the passage? And this is asking you not to make predictions. It's asking you to stay within the information that was already given to you. Now, the reason these question types matter more than their frequency is because most students overthink them. That means when they show up, they're often easier than average if you can recognize them right away. But students will see some unfamiliar, less common question type and think to themselves, oh no, this must be hard. So they slow down, they reread everything, and they start improvising, but that's backwards. The questions I'm about to talk about now are usually very formulaic. That means they are predictable. For example, resolve the paradox or resolve the discrepancy questions. These describe a situation where two facts seem incompatible. They'll use words like contradiction or inconsistency. But the key is that these are apparent contradictions, they're not real contradictions. So your job for paradox questions is not to pick a side, it's to explain instead how both facts could both be true at the same time. So think of it like this. There's somebody out there who is confused, and your job is to clear up the confusion. That is it. So the right answer will usually introduce a missing distinction. It will add in a condition or explain an overlooked factor. It's not denying the facts, it is reconciling them. So if an answer is rejecting one of the facts, that means it's wrong. Now, these could be easier than they look because they are actually straightforward. There's always going to be fact A, fact B, and a missing explanation. Your job is to find the explanation that is it. Now, let's talk about pointed issue questions, which I think are honestly one of the easiest types. These are dialogue questions where you have two different speakers, and your job is to find something they disagree about. That means they both express an opinion on it, and those opinions differ. So one person says yes, the other person says no. If one of the two speakers has no opinion on the issue, the answer is wrong. Now, in many pointed issue questions, the disagreement happens at the end of Speaker A's statement and at the beginning of Speaker B's response. So Speaker B is often responding directly to something Speaker A just said. That's where you want to look first. So the wrong answers here will usually describe something only one speaker mentions. It'll paraphrase background information or raise an issue neither speaker addresses directly. If both speakers are not clearly disagreeing, that means it is not the point at issue. Then there's principle questions. These could feel intimidating because they operate at a higher level of abstraction. They use words like principle or proposition or general rule, but the task is actually very consistent. There are two kinds of principle questions. The first type asks you to generalize the argument, and the second type asks you to strengthen the argument using a principle. In the first type, where it's abstraction, they're asking what general rule captures the reasoning in this argument. The right answer will describe the logic more broadly, and it'll go beyond the specific case, so it'll avoid referencing specific details. So if the answer is too narrow here, that means it's wrong. So a good answer in principal questions will feel kind of boring. It'll feel too obvious. It'll feel general. It will feel like it applies to many different situations. But in the other type, the principle is supporting the argument. It is strengthening the argument. So think of it like this. If this general rule is valid, then the specific argument makes sense. You are looking for a principle that bridges the logic. So a strengthened principle question operates at a higher level. It is using general rules instead of specific facts, but it'll still follow the same strengthened logic. Now, all of these types are rewarding the same thing. They're rewarding immediate recognition. So the moment that you know this is paradox, this is point at issue, this is a principal question, your strategy remains the same. You lock it in. Now, the worst thing you can do is treat these like generic logical reasoning questions, because that's going to cause you to overthink things and reread them and second guess yourself. They're just asking you to categorize. So high scorers are never afraid of these more rare question types. They're just thinking, it's one of those. And then they apply the formula, the same step-by-step approach regardless. And these questions are free points because many students never master them because they appear less frequently. And so if you can recognize them, you're the rare person who knows how to handle them, it's going to be easier for you than the more common question types are for other students. Now, rare doesn't mean that you can't predict it, because it has shown up fairly consistently. You will see paradox questions on pretty much every LSAT. You will see principal questions on every LSAT. Evaluate's a bit less common though. But once you know what these types are asking, they stop being so scary and you can solve them efficiently. But what comes down to is, of course, test day execution, meaning can you run the same process untimed as you can timed? When the clock is ticking and you're feeling the nerves, can you still perform? The biggest mistake students make on test day is they abandon their process. They start reacting instead of executing. They start rushing. Logical reasoning rewards discipline. Speed comes from wasting less time. Every second that you spend unsure of what they're asking you to do is a second that you never get back. Your job on every logical reasoning question, step one, is classification. Before you read the answers, you got to know, is there an argument? Which bucket am I in? What are they asking me to do? And if you don't know that, you stop and you reread the question stem. That step alone will prevent most careless errors. Now, students will often skim the question stem, and that's a huge mistake, because the question stem tells you the burden or standard of proof that you're under, whether you can bring in new information, and which mental tool to use. If you misread the question stem, no amount of logic is going to save you. Then, step two, once you know the question type, you should pause long enough to ask, what does the right answer have to do? Does it have to weaken the conclusion, or guarantee the conclusion, or ID the flaw? That tells you how to predict. Now, every question will have a really tempting or attractive wrong answer that sounds reasonable. It'll reuse language from the stimulus. And prediction protects you because it's coming from your brain. It's in your words. If the answer doesn't do the job that you predicted, doesn't matter how good it sounds, it's wrong. And then step three is elimination. Top scorers are not looking for the right answer, they are knocking out the wrong ones. Wrong answers are too strong, too weak, they're irrelevant, they're backwards, or they are addressing the wrong issue. So here's a simple test day framework. On pass one, you answer the questions that feel clear to you immediately. Then your second pass, you tackle the questions that require more thought, but are still pretty solvable. Then on your third pass, you return to questions that you flagged or skipped that you thought might be time sinks. This way you avoid getting stuck in the quicksand. And skipping is a strategy. Some questions are designed to eat up your time. And if you recognize one early, you flag it, you move on, you come back later. And your confidence will come from knowing that you can and will come back. So you want to aim to solve the first 10 questions in logical reasoning in roughly 10 to 12 minutes. You then build up a time bank that you can apply to the tougher questions that you might have flagged or skipped. And of course, that's a guideline, not a commandment. It's up to you about the particulars. Now, I want to talk about managing nerves and anxiety because the way to handle this is boring. You slow down just enough to run your process. Your confidence will return when you have returned to your structure, to return to your clear step-by-step approach. So if you feel like you're spiraling, just take a moment, pause, take a breath, close your eyes, and then think to yourself, what is your process? ID the question type, make a prediction, work by elimination. Now, there will be some cases where you're stuck between two answers. That's going to happen. And when it does, you ask yourself, which answer actually does the job? Usually, you'll find that one answer overreaches, it goes too far, and that is the wrong one. But if you ID'd the question type correctly, you predicted the job, and you were able to eliminate, your instinct is usually right. Changing answers out of anxiety is usually the wrong move. I want you to change your answer only if you misread the question stem, you misunderstood the argument, or you realized the answer doesn't do the job. Now, of course, you will miss questions. Everybody does. The danger is carrying over from one question into another. Each question is independent. You want to reset after every single one. So again, your test day process is you classify the question type, you predict your answer, you eliminate the wrong ones, you choose the right one, then you reset every single time. So remember, high scorers are not smarter on test day, they're calmer because they trust their process. The LSAT is a test of execution. If you treat it that way, your performance will become repeatable, and repetition is what produces high scores.